Here's my favorite, most ridiculous web original argument. All American Indians, all First Nations derive directly from the Philippines as Mexican laborers, and within 300 years, they inhabited the entire North and South America. The rainforests, the tundra, the deserts, the eastern woodlands. All these areas are really Filipinos. And this book right here supports it, which they only show the cover. So today we'll do a read-along, Asian slaves in colonial Mexico. All right? And not only does it distinguish the American black, but also distinguishes the Negrito. On page 48, it says, based on Negrito's physical appearance, Spaniards associated them with people from sub-Saharan Africa, whom they similarly perceived to be socially inferior. The Negritos were never incorporated into Hispanic society as indigenous. Page 48. They do not look like American Indians, neither do black folks. The Atlantic slave trade. Though on a far smaller scale, the Trans-Pacific slave trade served the same function as the Atlantic slave trade, which delivered thousands of Africans to Mexico during that same period. Both slave trades transported people who were meant to replace the indigenous labor force. Once again, smaller scale Trans-Pacific, even in Mexico, right? So when you're utilizing Trans-Pacific slave trade, you're going to see a pattern when you read this book. It says Chinos look like Indians, so they were Indians, not slaves. Slaves were people with African features. One of the reasons why they moved forward with African slaves, because there was a similar physiognomy to the American Indian. So they moved forward with Africans who had a totally distinct physical appearance. This book is saying this throughout the whole every chapter of the entire book. It's saying the same thing. And you'll see a pattern, whether people want to see the pattern or not. It says, to contemporaries, Chino slaves were similar in the physiognomy to the indigenous of Mexico, at least much more so than African slaves. Right? So once again, we're seeing a pattern of these people not looking like black folks. Indigenous of Mexico look nothing like black folk. They look similar to some of these people from the islands of Asia. So throughout this book that they never read, we'll see a pattern. Okay? The major difference between African and Chino slaves is that very few Chinos worked in the large sugar plantations. Sugar production throughout the Americas was associated with people, with African laborers through the 16th and 19th centuries. So same thing was true in the Caribbean and in the West Indies. Africans were associated with that sugar cultivation, not any other group. Okay, colonizers had to make sure their Chino slaves looked nothing like Indians, and one way was to brand the Chino slaves on the face. The practice was not customary for black slaves who were already marked by their black skin. Once again, they did not need to mark black people because they can tell us apart from the American Indians of Mexico. Does anybody get a pattern? But they had to mark the Chino slaves because there was a similar appearance. There was a resemblance. Chino slaves were cheaper to buy, so a lot of people preferred to buy them as opposed to the African slaves. Africans were associated with industry and labor based on stereotypes. And there's definitely a distinction between the American Indian and the African throughout all these chapters. I want everybody to pay attention to the next passage. This is going to really kind of seal the deal in terms of that distinction. The overseers in the case expressed a very problematic notion that nonetheless widely spread, believed that slaves of African descent were deemed stronger and more capable than Chino slaves. So like I said, Indians and Chino slaves were not interpreted to be as physically strong in terms of prowess as the African slaves. Once again, difference in appearance. Africans tend to be a little bit more muscular. It was an association based on distinct appearance. Former slaves of African descent could not claim the rights of the native population. In contrast, former Chino slaves had to pay tribute, but they were able to become Indians in a legal sense. And once again, this was possible because there was a similarity in appearance. The American Indian resembled this group. Black people did not look like the American Indian, and you'll see this over and over if you open up the book. As a result of the colonial government new policy on Indian and Muslim slaves, the Manila market shifted to African slaves, and because they pose very few challenges. So you don't have to deal with the same litigious matters because you have a group that physically looks different and distinct than the Indian and Chino slaves who look similar. We'll read more on this. A white cargo is next, y'all.